any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric, from feedback to learner autonomy? We'll discuss it all on TEFLology. Welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast. Today, we bring you an interview with Donna M. Brinton. Donna Brinton is a private educational consultant. She has served as senior lecturer in the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California, where she designed and taught online classes in the MAT TESOL program. Prior to that, she served as professor of TESOL at Soka University of America and as associate director of the Center for World Languages at the University of California, Los Angeles. Donna is the co-author and co-editor of numerous professional texts, including Content-Based Second Language Instruction, The Structure of Modern English, and, with Marguerite and Snow, recently completed the second edition of The Content-Based Classroom for University of Michigan Press. Donna has also co-authored several commercial English language textbooks and numerous journal and book articles. Her fields of expertise include materials and curriculum development, teaching pronunciation, content-based instruction, and the use of instructional technology in language teaching. Matthew and Matt sat down with Donna at Kanda University of International Studies to discuss teacher training, bridging the gap between research and practice, and content and language integrated learning. We hope you enjoy the interview.
Okay, so this is Matt.
And this is also Matt, or Matthew.
And we're sitting here today. It's July, it's mid-July, it's very hot, but we're very pleased to be sitting here with Donna Brinton. Thank you for joining us today.
Very pleased to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Thank you very much. So we've prepared some questions for you, and we'd like to open with a couple of kind of introductory questions, if we may. We had some email correspondence together leading up to this interview, and in your email you mentioned lots of really interesting things. So I've based a few of these first questions on that email alone, actually.
Okay, fine.
So you first mentioned that you took early retirement as a lecturer in 2006, I believe. And I wonder if possible, if you could chart your career up to that point, and then maybe tell us what you've been doing since that point.
Okay, sure. Sort of a long career up until 2006, because I was at UCLA, which was my primary university, University of California, Los Angeles, for close to 30 years. Prior to that, I was an English language teacher in the classroom. I worked both in the U.S. and abroad. I taught in Germany, English as a foreign language. Even before that, I was a teacher of German. Originally, I studied German at the university, and I thought that I would become a German teacher. But because there weren't very many opportunities for that, I heard that the German government was hiring native speaker teachers, and that they were putting those teachers in tax-exempt status. So I thought, that sounds like a great deal. And I ended up in Germany for about 5 years, teaching both at the high school my first year. Actually, it's kind of a high school, middle school combination. And then I taught in the adult education environment, which was really English for business and management. Okay. And I also taught like adults who just wanted to go back and learn things. I taught English for tourism purposes, and I taught Cambridge proficiency courses, things like that. Okay. Yeah.
You've done a lot.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Was there any one of those experiences that really kind of stood out for you in your career?
Well, I think the 30 years at UCLA were very formative years for me, because I moved from teaching language to teaching teachers, and that probably was a really big jump in my career. And then you asked me also what I've been doing since that time period. I began, even when I was still at UCLA, doing work with teachers abroad, primarily through U.S. Department of State, which has a program called English Language Specialist.
Okay.
And I think the first time that I did that was many, many years ago in Thailand. Usually I'm brought for about 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks to work with teachers in other countries. I've probably worked in about 40 different countries in that capacity, so that's also been a really important part of my life because I think it gives me face validity in terms of talking to teachers about how English is taught around the world. I can tell them from personal experience from working with teachers in so many different parts of the world. So, yeah.
Sorry, could you talk a little bit about that transition or the development of becoming a teacher trainer, maybe especially in terms of there's not a lot of training to become a teacher trainer.
Right.
And so maybe how you moved into that. And also, do you think the qualities that somebody has as a language teacher are completely transferable to teacher training, or is there a big difference between the two?
In my case, the transition, I think, was pretty accidental. They needed somebody to teach the course, and they said, hey, Donna, would you like to teach this methodology course? I was very fortunate because it was a section of a course that had 2 other more experienced teachers doing it. So maybe some of that, I co-planned with them and I did some observation of them teaching, and I think that was very important. But sort of to answer your question about, do the qualities of being a teacher translate to being a teacher trainer? Absolutely. I mean, if you're a good teacher, then you have a pretty good idea of what it means to teach an effective lesson. And I also think it's really important for teacher educators to keep one foot in the classroom, in the language classroom. And I was able to do that pretty much over my career at UCLA. I was also a program administrator, so I would do my program administration work, and usually once a year I would teach a language course as well as the teacher education courses. And I think that, also gives you that base validity that you need. I mean, there's nothing worse than a teacher educator who hasn't been in the classroom for 30 years.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
This has just reminded me, I interviewed Gabriel Diaz-Maggioli last year, I think it was, and he said something like, very rarely do you wish to become a teacher trainer. It's wished of you to become a teacher trainer.
Yeah.
Was that the case with you? Or?
Well, I had never really thought about it, and once I started doing it, I fell in love with doing that. And it corresponds also to a lot of the stuff that I do as a writer. So I do, write books and articles about teaching in the classroom, effective methods of teaching.
Yeah.
And so I think that's become kind of my primary interest.
And something you said earlier, or something that relates to this actually, you said that one of your roles is that you see yourself as a practitioner who translates research into terms that classroom teachers can understand.
Right.
And I guess this is one role of a teacher trainer, I guess, as well as a writer.
As well as a writer, yeah.
What does this kind of approach entail when you're writing? How do you translate?
Well, it's pretty much summarizing the various strands of research and bringing them together in a form that teachers can understand. And having done a lot of this, I've done edited volumes, and I've also done volumes that I usually co-authored with other people in the field. Good researchers aren't necessarily the best people to write about their research for teachers. They're very good at writing for other researchers, but I can tell you from having done these edited volumes that as an editor you work a lot with, trying to make this something that reaches out to teachers and that they can even understand, to bring some of the buzzwords, down to a level where the teachers can understand what it is. So I would say that's been a pretty big mission in my life to do that. And I've done a lot of work as an editor on these kinds of volumes. I was also a journal editor for about 8 years, and I think that helped me learn how to be a more effective editor.
Yeah. Can I ask, in that case, how important do you think it is that teachers, do you think it's necessary for all teachers to be aware of the kind of research that's going on and the methodologies and all that kind of stuff?
I definitely think so. We talk about fossilized learners, and I think there is such a thing as a fossilized teacher, and that would be a teacher who was trained 15 years ago and hasn't kept abreast of what's happening and really isn't able to flex because they don't know which direction to go in. So I definitely think so. And I think, professional organizations are really, really important in that respect, to be a member of either your local teacher association or an international teacher association is the best way for teachers to keep abreast of what's going on in the field. And it's great for them to also conduct research, to do action research or other types of reflective research, but more than anything, just to be a little bit more up to date on what's going on in the field. And that's, that's something that I think is really important.
Something else that you mentioned as being quite important to you, again in an email that you sent me, it was a very interesting email. You talked about the nature of working collaboratively with colleagues, and you said that a lot of your writing has mostly been written with your close...
Almost all.
Almost all of your writing, okay.
Almost all of my writing has been collaborative.
Right, okay.
Well, I was in a unique position at the university because I was a lecturer, and the way that lecturers are evaluated in our system is solely based on teaching. And so I didn't have that publish or perish pressure that a lot of my other professor-level colleagues had, which was one reason why I, would sort of reach out and say, it doesn't really matter. I don't need this publication for, keeping my job, but I want to do this because I want to be able to write about this for teachers. I usually hooked up with other colleagues, either in my own institution or locally in the California area where I work, but sometimes also, and this is becoming more and more possible, colleagues who live quite a ways away from you. So, and I think that I feel that my writing is better as a result of having multiple voices as input into what it is I write.
I think we'd agree.
This podcast is very much about the collaboration between the three of us.
Great,
And I think the third podcaster, Rob, who's not here today, but he's probably listening, he wrote a whole article with somebody that he'd never met. It was all purely done online. And
I've done that also.
So
it's fascinating. Generally, I know my co-authors, but in some cases,
Okay, great. So actually, we're here currently in central Tokyo because you're about to give a talk.
Correct.
And the title of which is CBI and CLIL, Same But Different. So maybe could you tell us a little bit about what your talk is about? But maybe by going back and defining, or maybe that's part of what your talk is, but talking about these two terms, CBI and CLIL.
Content-based instruction, CBI, and content and language integrated learning, CLIL, are very complementary approaches. Very often what you'll find in the field is people saying, well, CLIL is something completely different from CBI. CBI is something completely different from CLIL. In 1997, my closest collaborator, Ann Snow, and I, together with a professor from the University of Ontario, Mari Vesha, wrote a volume called Content-Based Second Language Instruction. And then later Ann Snow and I did a volume on the content-based classroom. The content-based classroom talked a lot about various forms of CBI. CLIL wasn't really on the horizon even at the time. So it's probably an older, much older kind of tradition than CLIL. But we just recently came out with a second edition of that book. And it's 20 years later after the original book that we wrote, which is pretty unusual to bring out a second edition 20 years later. And we had to do a lot of thinking about how to update, our vision of content-based instruction. And we wanted to make it a lot more international, but we also wanted to include CLIL. And CLIL and CBI haven't always been on the best of terms. I think one of the things we wanted to do was bring in a high-level CLIL practitioner, researcher, and have that person write about CLIL. And we went back and forth a lot between ourselves and also with this practitioner, Christiane Dalton-Puffer, trying to say, well, where do we think CLIL fits in? And we sort of finally agreed that it very much fits within this bigger umbrella of integrated content and language learning or content-based instruction, but it's sort of its own thing, and that's why the title's same but different. It shares a lot of similarities, and it is part of the much bigger tradition of integrating language and content, but it has a lot of unique features, which I'm going to be talking about in the talk today. Yeah.
Okay. I went to a presentation recently. It was, I can't remember the exact title, but it was about, the assessment was assessment in CLIL. And the presenter started by explaining that there are over 200 varieties of CLIL.
Wow.
And I don't know exactly what that means, and maybe he had found, up to 200, or I think he said 217 in the end, different definitions of CLIL. One of the identifying features or the most common identifying feature that I've come across in terms of CLIL is in terms of assessment, that both the content and the language are assessed. Does that kind of match with your understanding of CLIL? Or?
Well, yeah, it does. And it also matches with my understanding of certain variants of CBI, like the adjunct model, which I'll also be talking about in the talk today. But I'm also going to be presenting this wonderful diagram by Leo van Leer that's the sort of sliding scale where you can see that the sliding scale may sometimes focus more on language depending on the variant that we're talking about, and sometimes more on content. And it's kind of rare that it's smack in the middle of this kind of continuum. So I think it depends a lot on the context, the goals of instruction, the students themselves, the teacher, the kind of preparation that the teacher has. So there's always both, but there may be this heavier focus on one element rather than the other, and that has to obviously play out in the assessment too. Yeah.
I think I also went to another talk where I saw this described as like a mixing table, where you're turning up the content, you're turning down the language, and then I think another one of those mixing things was the procedure. So you're turning that up too, and it seems like, like you said, it's a fine balance between all of those like varieties, like variants in the class.
And when Ann Snow and I first talked about content-based and first wrote about it, what we were able to see was really these three, we call them the prototype models, the theme-based, sheltered, and adjunct. But even at the time that we wrote about them, we said, there's so much possibility for flexibility, and that's where I could see that you come up with 200 and whatever it was, forms of something. Certainly, when I go around the world and I talk about content-based, sometimes people in the audience come up afterwards a little bit puzzled, like, well, we're doing something kind of similar to what you talked about, but it's not exactly the same, and so we must be doing it wrong. Well, no, there is no wrong way to do it. It just depends so much on the contextual factors.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about some of those terms. I think what I read, I'm not sure if this was from an article of yours some years ago, and I'm not sure if it's been updated, but theme-based, sheltered, and adjunct models. Could you briefly tell us the difference between those?
Well, theme-based is pretty much what you see in the textbook market today. So what you'll see very often is you'll have one unit, one unit that is devoted to a particular theme, say global warming or women in the workplace, and then the next unit summarizes another theme, deals with another content, and that's very often criticized because you move from theme to theme to theme. In some of the textbooks, it's a 4-page format, so the learners never really get comfortable with the language that they need to talk about or write about that theme before they're already on to the next theme. But in theme-based, you could also have sustained content so that it's a much longer unit, and maybe it slices it up into different sort of sub-themes. So I don't mean to say that theme-based is always just a short theme. It depends. But it's a language teacher who's using a theme or subject matter content as kind of a carrier topic, as a contextualizing device for the language that they're teaching. The sheltered model is something that is pretty common in the US and other places where you have large immigrant populations coming into the schools. I live in Los Angeles, and we have as many as 97 languages in one school district. And so you can imagine the content teachers who like walk into their classroom and have 15 different languages. How are they going to communicate content? And one of the solutions has been in school districts that have large numbers of home language speakers of other languages, they will shelter them, which means they put just the non-native speaking students in a classroom, say biology, for non-native speakers as opposed to the mainstream class. And those teachers have special techniques. They've been trained specially to work with these students who are still gaining expertise in academic language. And so it's a content teacher who's teaching the content, but incidentally, a lot of language is also being picked up. And then the third model, so we have language teacher, content teacher. The third model, you really have both, right? So you have a content teacher and a language teacher, and that's the model that I have most of my experience with because I worked for about 8 years at UCLA in a program for entering first-year students who had been identified by our administration as probably not going to make it through their first year, and this was sort of a model that was meant to help these students transition better into the university. So I was paired with a psychology professor, and my students took 2 classes. They took this large lecture format psychology class, which was Introduction to Psychology, and they took my class, where most of what I did in the class was from the psychology content area. And the psychology professor and I collaborated quite closely, in terms of what it was he was going to do, what it was I was going to do on any given day and any given week. So, I would be dealing with the language of definition on day 1 when he was talking about what is psychology. And when he was talking about the various branches of psychology, I would be dealing with the language of, whatever. Yeah, so
that's interesting. I've never heard of that model before.
Yeah, it's not that common, mainly because it's a fairly expensive model of education. You have to have 2 teachers, and
I think when people hear CLIL and just a very kind of basic description of it, they assume that it's a teacher, and perhaps this does happen in some cases, but it's a teacher who's both has experience and a specialization in language teaching and in a specific area of content. Does that actually happen a lot that you know of? Or?
Yeah, I think that especially in the high school and middle school environment, and that's where you usually see the term CLIL being used. But now that you're seeing this trend toward globalization, what you see is a lot of universities now offering these EMI courses, English Medium Instruction courses, which is really CLIL at the tertiary level. And again, you've got a well-versed content teacher who is addressing both content and language, but primarily I think there with our sliding scale, the focus is more on content. And a lot of these teachers they come into this and they're not really trained in how to do this. So that is depending on the university and depending on the country in which this is happening. I think probably in the high school, the teachers get a little bit more support and they get a little bit more training. One
one model that some universities, at least in Japan, use is they'll ask their language teachers, what other content area do you know about? You can pick the content, and you can use that as the content in your CLIL course, and then we'll offer it to students.
And that would be more like a sheltered course because it's a language teacher teaching a sustained content course, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I did some work, I believe it was last year here in Japan at Toyo University, and I had a group of EMI professors, and that was fascinating because they told lots of stories about, the difficulties that they encountered trying to implement EMI. But I actually had one pair of teachers from a particular university come up and say, we're actually doing the adjunct model. We just didn't know that that's what it was called. And one of them was a language instructor, one was a content instructor, and they were kind of co-teaching this class. So in my humble opinion, that's the sort of ideal scenario. It's the one that works the best. But like I said, it's not one that you see all that commonly. Yeah.
On that similar topic, I work for one of the tourism faculty at that university, and there's a number of reasons, but I see, as I'm working in the tourism faculty, I felt like I might as well try and learn about tourism and become, I've termed it content aware. I'm not sure if that's a term
I like that term a lot,
that's used, but or content informed, which I don't feel I am at the moment, but I think I've just kind of started a developmental process towards learning more about the tourism industry. And what do you have any sort of advice for me, and what should I be aware of or
well, I think
careful of?
Do you have access to tourism people that you could?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
I mean, I think if you can make it more collaborative, or at least bring them in and ask their opinions and get them to look at some of the materials. That would be probably the best way to go. And I think building a unit like that, you learn a lot in the process. You need to find sources, and as you find sources, you inform yourself a little bit further as well. So, yeah.
One of the problems, and we talked about this with another colleague of ours, is that there could be an assumption amongst learners that they see us as being professionals or experts in that content when we're not. And I heard one colleague saying it kind of deprofessionalizes the field that you're working in. What would you say to that kind of skeptic?
Well, I think you need to make it very clear to the students. I'm a language teacher primarily. We're using this, again, as kind of a carrier topic because it matches your needs and interests. And, in some cases, you may have more expertise in this topic than I do. And I think being open about that would be important. It works both ways. There are also the content teachers who we are a little skeptical about some of the EMI stuff that's maybe going on because we're not sure that they really know how to address language issues, and yet that's part of the model. And in some of the research that's been done about that, what you see is that most of the content teachers focus primarily on vocabulary because that's what seems most evident to them. So they'll focus on that, but they don't really know what to do with grammar. They don't really know what to do with reading skills. And that's where, again, I sort of always argue for this more collaborative model that would be, to my way of thinking, the ideal scenario.
So CLIL has become a very kind of popular, it's almost like a buzzword in Japan now. And universities will, base advertisements around it, and they'll, teachers or departments will get directives from higher up saying, make your course a CLIL course.
Right.
And we don't know what that is, but do it. Make it turn your your department into a CLIL course. Do you think there's a danger of people? It seems that like as you mentioned, it can cover a wide variety of types of courses as long as content is involved. But do you think there is a danger that it'll be misunderstood or misrepresented, or is it possible to misapply the term?
I think any bandwagon that people jump on, there's always that danger. It doesn't mean that the bandwagon is a bad thing, but it means that teachers, if they don't have adequate introduction to it, won't really know what it is they're supposed to be doing. So that's where teacher education comes in. That's kind of why my colleague and I decided we would, roll up our sleeves and do this second edition of the book. And I think there's a lot of literature out there. There are a lot of people with expertise in integrated language and content, CLIL included, that need to be brought in so that the teachers, hear from them how to do this in an efficient and effective fashion. Any methodology can be done badly.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the methodology is bad. It just means that it needs an understanding.
Yeah. But I totally agree. I think just because of the maybe the broad definitions or the 200 whatever, people do find it hard to get a grasp of what it really is.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's true. That's true of any. It's true of any form of CBI also. Yeah. Like I said, now we have a new map of CBI in our new book, and instead of the 3 branches that we had in our original publication, there's something like 15 branches, and then there's one branch that says additional hybrid models. That's the catch-all, which is probably the other 200.
Right, okay.
Yeah. But I think what also happens is that if you're writing about this, you're writing about what has been presented at conferences or what you're familiar with or what has been written up and you can find in journals. But there are all these other things that are happening with teachers behind closed doors, experimenting, and those are the things that we don't really know about. So it's important that that we inform ourselves about these other possibilities. Yeah.
So would you say this is a good kind of direction for the future of content-based, research focus?
It's been 30-some years now that it's been going strong, and CLIL also, obviously a lot of people are receptive to it. I am a teacher who was trained in the grammatical syllabus. I certainly wouldn't want to go back to that, sort of clutching at some artificial context that was supposed to make the grammar meaningful to the students. I will say that the first time I ever walked into the adjunct model classroom that I was working in, and I saw the students' reactions to, wow, this matches exactly what we're doing, and it's exactly what we need and what we're talking about. That was sort of like a wonderful experience for me because it freed me up to do things that I had never been able to do before. So I think there's a lot of continuing promise.
That sort of classroom that you described, which is just very grammar focused and talking about the language rather than using it, seems like it's very hard to know what's happening in classrooms all around the world, and maybe it is still hanging on in certain areas.
Yes, it's very much alive in lots of places.
Okay,
places, but it's also. Teachers are very often aware that this is sort of a dated method and we should be doing something different. I think that awareness is pretty much there in most places that I go.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We could keep on talking for hours, but it's been great talking to you today.
Really,
so
thank you for the opportunity, and
Thank you.
I really look forward to seeing some of the other podcasts, listening to some of the other podcasts that you've done. So thanks for doing this. I think it's a great, a great service to the profession and to teachers everywhere.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. We hope you enjoyed the interview, and we would like to thank Donna Brinton again for taking the time to speak with us. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can send an email to TEFLology@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter @TEFLology. We have a Facebook page, and we also have a website, TEFLology-podcast.com, where you can find all of our previous episodes as well as links to information about the podcast. We also have a book, Podcasting and Professional Development, a guide for English language teachers, which is available from Amazon and other bookstores. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back with another episode soon.